There we go. Okay, and I can see you guys. Great. So I'm really thrilled about this class. It's a topic that I have been looking forward to since the beginning of the class, digging into and doing some research and getting to a point to where we've laid all of these foundations to where we are today in Unit 8, and to discuss the history of the Messianic Jewish movement. So in our recent classes, and again, if you missed some of the classes, they're all on recording, and they kind of paint a picture and lay the foundations for what we're going to talk about today. We've seen that the great divide in the historic church and the Jewish people was a tragic schism within the twofold people of God. Last class, we discussed in some depth how Israel and the nations are intended to share in an ongoing relationship of mutual blessing in the Messiah. And in spite of all its anti-Jewish, we'll say, handicapped of the medieval period and whatnot, the historic Gentile church has, in a meaningful way, remained connected to Israel through Yeshua, the Messiah, who is the heart of Israel. And so consider, how radically Judaism has, in fact, shaped the church today. And then in spite of corporately rejecting Yeshua, by holding on to the Torah, Israel has, in a similar sense, remained linked with the presence of Yeshua, the living heart of the Torah. We saw this in Romans in depth last class. Paul indicates that there has always been a remnant within Israel who looks to the Messiah. Yet we've seen how 17 centuries of supersessionism has left a tear in the heart of the community of Messiah that we need to heal. We closed our last session with a vision for Israel's messianic awakening, and an idyllic Messianic Jewish vision to bridge the gap, if you will. The Jewish fold of the community of Messiah must carry the sanctifying presence of Messiah within the wider Jewish community, while also linking the Gentile church to the wider Israel, and establish once again a relationship of mutual blessing within the community of Messiah. Today, our goal is to take a look at the development of the modern Messianic Jewish movement in light of this vision, that the Jewish fold will carry the sanctifying presence of Messiah within the wider Jewish community while linking the Gentile church to wider Israel and establish this relationship of mutual blessing. And then after I do a summary of this history, I will interview Rabbi Rich Nichol to share firsthand experience of his last 40 plus years in the movement and a bit about where we're headed. Okay? So, let's see. Now, for this class, I will be drawing a lot off of Rabbi Mark Kinzer's chapter in Post-Missionary Messianic Judaism called From Missionary to Post-Missionary Messianic Judaism. This was in our readings for this week. So if you read that, you've got a bit of a preview of some of the things we'll be discussing today. Prior to the 19th century, Jews who entered the Christian church were required to renounce Jewish practice, to sever ties with the Jewish community. We've looked at this in depth. The Great Divide was so deep that some of the most zealous and anti-Jewish Christians were actually Jewish converts. So Nicholas Donin of the 13th century, Pablo Cristiani of the 13th century, Johannes Pfefferkorn of the 16th century. These knowledgeable Jewish converts used their knowledge to missionize the Jews by denouncing rabbinic writings, inciting Jewish hatred, burning Jewish texts. And so from a Jewish perspective, Jewish converts to Christianity were not only seen as apostates to a foreign religion, they were treacherous enemies. Let's see. And rather than Yeshua faith being a part of the Jewish hope, the Messiah is a part of the Jewish hope, as it was, as we've seen in the first few centuries in the New Testament, the only thing that made the Christian mission to the Jews distinct from the Christian mission to the pagans was that they considered the Jews to be even worse. So through the Protestant Reformation, this was the case. We discussed how the Protestant reformers like Luther and Calvin were outspokenly anti-Jewish and supersessionist. Even So, in spite of this, they unknowingly planted seeds that would create the landscape for the Messianic Jewish movement in the future. So those standing on the reformers' shoulders were able to read their Bibles for themselves in their own language and ask new questions. In the 17th and the 18th century, we saw a new explicit love for Judaism called Philo-Judaism and Christian Hebraicism arise. We hear about Protestant Christians hiring Jews to teach them Hebrew in order to read the Torah. Protestant denominations like the English Puritans of the 17th century focused more on the books of Moses than Christians had in the past, leading to a more nuanced view of Jewish devotion and the Torah. And further, the Renaissance inspired a love for Jewish culture. Humanist Giovanni Pica del Mirandola of the 15th century became a student of Jewish mysticism. He inspired Christian study of rabbinic literature and set the stage for an emergence of new Christian scholarship on the Talmud. The Jewish Enlightenment, called the Haskalah, blurred the lines between Christians and Jews, and both Jewish and Christian thinkers started to think and write about the relationship and the boundaries between these two estranged siblings. So by the 19th century, the Christian approach to the Jews had changed. Rather than an erroneous religion that was devoid of all truths, Christians began to see Judaism as equal in essence with Christianity, though less developed. And it even conceded that Judaism had things to offer Christianity. It was still unthinkable, however, that a Jew could be a believer in Yeshua and remain a Jew. But this new approach allowed thinkers and scholars to begin to reread the Bible's story of the Jewish people with more positive eyes. It opened the doors. The next major development was the emergence of dispensationalism in the 19th century. Here, the Jewish people would be restored and were finally recognized as central to God's eschatological plan for the world. So for the first time in some 15 centuries, dispensationalism reclaimed the fundamental distinction between the church and the Jewish people. It realized that the prophets required the existence of the Jewish people at the end days. They would become the 144,000 Jewish representatives for the Messiah in the book of Revelation. And this theology radically changed the way that Christians thought about the Jewish people, who now became key for Yeshua's return. The significant change in Christian missionary approach to the Jews was that in centuries past, Jews who converted to Christianity were expected to completely turn their back on their Jewish heritage and identity. Now, for the first time, Jews were expected to convert to Christianity, but as the fulfillment of and the culmination of one's Jewish identity. It is a remarkable development in some regard towards healing the schism. However, dispensationalism kind of created a waiting game until all the Jews in the end would evolve and emerge from their cocoon fully as completed Christians. Still not good news from a Jewish perspective. Ironically, it still means an end to the Jews. It's just delayed to a later dispensation. We're still a ways off from the theology in the Gospels and in the book of Acts, where Jews who embraced the Messiah remained unambiguous Jews. And there's no room for ongoing Jewish life and community as a response to God's ongoing covenant with the Jewish people in Yeshua. But it got people to think very differently about the Jewish people, and it motivated Christians to invest in new kinds of missionary endeavors to the Jews. So the first missionary society devoted to Jewish missions was established in 1809 in England. This spread to America as dispensationalism spread among American evangelicals. And these new Jewish missions movements led to the development of what is called the Hebrew Christian movement of the 19th century. Within the Jewish world, things were changing as well. Prior to the Haskalah, which is the Jewish Enlightenment, Jews in Europe, they lived on their own in self-governing communities, separate from their Christian neighbors. There was no distinction between Jewish religious life and Jewish national identity. There isn't even a word for religion in the Hebrew language because all of life was simply Judaism, you see? This all changed with the Enlightenment. Jews were now seeking to identify with and even participate in public life of their home countries without forsaking their Jewish identity. This requires a new division from Jewish religious life and outward public life. You see? The Haskalah introduced this distinction between Jewish religion and Jewish nationality. So Moses Mendelssohn of the 18th century wrote about Judaism being a philosophy and a religion rather than a nationality. The Reformed Jewish movement is birthed out of this conviction. Jews could be committed Germans or loyal Americans in public. But the opposite also became true. Jews could conceive of themselves as Jewish nationalists without being religious. So thus we see here Theodor Herzl and secular Zionism develop. For them, religion was not relevant in the modern world anymore, but Jewish nationalism was paramount. The distinction is critical for understanding the Hebrew Christian movement. Jews could now enter a church for the first time, embrace Christianity as their new religious identity, and yet still identify as a Jew nationally. They couldn't do this before. It didn't exist. Further, as the role of Israel in the biblical model of the end times became more clear, Jewish nationalism and even non-religious Jewish heritage could also be celebrated inside the church. So basically, you guys heard about Mendelssohn, Herzl, Frey. Did you hear about Frey, or was that cut out?
That was cut out.
Yeah, I'll go back a little. Frey. Okay. Yeah. So, anyways, you guys get the idea. Hopefully, we got Herzl, Zionism. The idea, this distinction, just by review, if you didn't get this, that this is critical for understanding the Hebrew Christian movement, is the distinction that was made available to us by Jewish nationalism versus religious identity. So let's go on to Samuel Frey, and this is actually really cool. In 1813, Joseph Samuel Frey, along with 41 Jewish Yeshua believers, formed an association in London called B'nai Avraham, the children of Avraham. And this is a remarkable thing for its time. They celebrated the Jewish holy days. It was very confrontational, if you will. They focused on Christian missions to the Jews rather than establishing a Jewish Yeshua believing community, but they still lived some parts of Jewish life for the first time. Okay. Let's see. Now, during the reign of Queen Victoria in the late 19th century, the Hebrew Christian Benjamin Disraeli became the Prime Minister of Britain, of the whole British Empire. And he was accused of being a crypto-Jew who secretly practiced Judaism. He stood by his conviction and remarkably said that he was both fully Jewish and fully Christian. You see how this couldn't have happened before? The Queen asked him once if he was a Jew or a Christian, and he replied, "Madam, I am the missing page between the Old and the New Testament." See? So we're thinking about these categories in new ways. It's remarkable. Jewish believers in Yeshua, for the first time since the first few centuries, were seeking to remain connected with the Jewish people in a public way. In 1866, the Hebrew Christian Alliance was established, and the American Hebrew Christian Alliance in 1915. Its purpose explicitly was to Christian missions toward the Jews and to help evangelical churches to best evangelize the Jews. Now, what made it different from years past was that they also genuinely represented Jewish interests to the church. They supported the Jewish state. They even joined the Zionist Organization of America in the 1920s and 1930s. So again, they're against being Jewish religiously, but they're supporting Jewish nationalism. The Hebrew Christians, condemned anti-Jewish sentiments and anti-Jewish teachings in the evangelical church, and they were among the first to alert the evangelical community in America of the horrors of the Holocaust. They were doing their best to represent Yeshua as they understood him to the Jews. Now that said, while the Hebrew Christian movement identified as Jews nationally, again, for the most part, they rejected their Jewish religious identity. They carried the supersessionist theology from the past into their religious life and identified as Christians who were freed from the Mosaic law. They rejected Sabbath, they rejected the holy day observance, and they rejected the dietary laws. So we're still a ways off from the Jewish believers in the book of Acts and our Jewish presence within the community of Yeshua. But for the first time, it's possible for a Jew to still call himself or herself a Jew and to live as a Christian, you see? Now, in the realm of ideas, an awakening often requires many small steps. Each new development allows us to reevaluate other assumptions and open our eyes to something that was inconceivable before. And in the 1880s, Hebrew Christian Joseph Rabinowitz saw the forest through the trees. Raised in a Hasidic Jewish community, Rabinowitz was exposed to the Heskala as a young man. He set aside his traditional religious upbringing and became a Jewish nationalist. In 1882, he moved to Jerusalem to pursue a settlement in the land of Israel, and he embraced Yeshua as a Jew on the Mount of Olives. His conclusion was that Israel could only be restored in Yeshua, our brother. He was inspired to do something inconceivable, to establish a Hebrew Christian church. Rather than Hebrew Christians simply joining mainstream Christian denominations, he saw the need for an autonomous Jewish body in the community of Messiah. And the idea was hotly debated in Hebrew Christian circles. However, as Rabbi Mark Kinzer says, the genie would never again be put back in the bottle. He won over some leading figures in the Christian mission movements, including biblical scholar Franz Delitzsch, and he convinced them actually to baptize him in a way that he would not belong to any one Christian denomination. Why? Because in his words, he felt that Jews in Yeshua must be regarded as a member of the Church of Christ, that was his word for the ecclesia, the community of Messiah, and not as members of the denomination to which his baptizer might belong. He wanted to build a new Jewish community in Yeshua, which would be free to live as a religious Jewish community in Yeshua. And he would call it the Israelites of the New Covenant. Rabinowitz insisted that the Jewish believers should practice circumcision, honor the Sabbath, keep the Passover and other Jewish holy days, not as a missionary tactic, but in order to preserve Jewish national identity in the Jewish community. However, the weight of centuries of supersessionism still dominated the religious sphere. Delitzsch and most of the other Hebrew Christians did not agree. They argued that Israel's national distinctives could be upheld without circumcision, by worshiping on Sunday instead of the Sabbath, because the Messiah ended Jewish religious life. In the book of Acts, Jewish life for Jewish believers in Yeshua was the assumption. It was how Jews lived out their faith in Yeshua. Within a few centuries, supersessionism began to take shape, and Jewish life for Jews was viewed as optional first. We learned about this with Justin Martyr. Then it was an oddity that was frowned upon but permitted, and eventually Jewish observance became erroneous and sinful. After 15 centuries of supersessionism, Rabinowitz argued passionately that Jews should at least be permitted to live as Jews once again. It's the chiastic healing, if you will, the things that go this way, and then it comes back together in the reverse order that it fell apart. He did this by focusing on the national benefits. A Jew does not sin by not keeping Shabbat, he argued, but he becomes estranged from his people, you see. According to Kinzer, for Rabinowitz, this national Jewish identity was covenantal in nature, and thus obligatory for Jewish believers, but not in the realm of sin. That was his discussion. Though Rabinowitz had gathered a small community called the Israelites of the New Covenant, by his death in 1899, he had not seen his dream for a sustainable Jewish Yeshua-believing community come to life. Now, we move to Hungarian Rabbi Isaac Lichtsteinstein, who became a Jewish Yeshua believer in 1883. He kept his Yeshua faith secret for several years before renouncing his rabbinical position in 1892 in Hungary and publicly proclaiming his commitment to Yeshua. Like Rabinowitz, he refused to be publicly baptized as a converted Christian. Instead, he immersed himself in the name of Yeshua in a Jewish ritual bath. He did this because he wanted to retain his status in the Jewish community as a Jew, and there was no other way to be immersed in Yeshua at that time. It was a new idea. In a public way, Lichtsteinstein continued to live as a traditional Jew and refused to associate himself with any missionizing group, in his words, that converted Jews into Christian denominational churches. He felt passionately that Jews in Yeshua must remain Jewish and part of the wider Jewish community without being absorbed into the mainstream Christian denominations. Another early Messianic Jewish pioneer was Paul Levertoff. He was actually a descendant of Rabbi Shneur Zalman, the founder of Chabad Judaism or Chabad Hasidism. Levertoff became a follower of Yeshua in 1897. He held a chair of Hebrew and Rabbinics at Delitzsch's school, the Hebrew Christian Institute. And though he had become an ordained minister in the Church of England, so he departed from the others a bit, he also held to the ideal of a Jewish branch of Christianity, as he called it, which would embody the essentials of the Christian faith in Jewish terms. So this is how people are thinking of these things. Now, because of his connections with Hasidism, the Jewish mystical tradition, he felt that Hasidic Judaism's Jewish spirituality was the best way to reintegrate Yeshua faith into Judaism. He had a small group of Jewish believers who would meet for Shabbat worship and traditional Hebrew liturgy. Now, what makes Rabinowitz, Lichtsteinstein, and Levertoff different from many other Hebrew Christian leaders of their day was that their orientation towards the Jewish people was not purely missional, it was ecclesiological. Let me say that again. Their orientation to the Jewish people was not only missional, it was ecclesiological. While each of them passionately wanted to see their Jewish brothers and sisters embrace Yeshua as the Messiah, that's key. They really wanted to see their Jewish brothers and sisters come to know Yeshua, like Paul did. But their approach to Jewish identity and Jewish life and their construct of a Jewish Yeshua community was not simply a tactic or a strategy adopted for the sake of sharing the good news with Jews. It stood on its own. Instead, it serves as a healing role within the wider community of Yeshua faith. It's ecclesiological. Now, these Jewish communities would not only bear witness for the church within Israel, for Yeshua within Israel, but also bear witness for Israel within the church. Their vision was that the ecclesia, in their language, the church, needed to have a distinctive Jewish congregation which would live as religious Jewish communities. Not as a missionary tactic, but simply because they were Jews in the Messiah. This is key. Their ideas became the seeds of the modern Messianic Jewish movement. And even further, in Rabbi Mark Kinzer's terminology, a post-missionary Messianic Judaism. Now, like these three Hebrew Christian pioneers, Rabbi Mark's term post-missionary Messianic Judaism does not mean that it is not passionate about Jewish believers embracing the Messiah. I want to say that very clearly. It does not mean that at all. It means rather that the identity and the life as a Jewish community in Yeshua is rooted in its ecclesiological role within the covenantal life of Israel rather than an advanced missionary tactic. Jewish life is inseparable from Yeshua, who is the heart of Israel. And we would thus identify and live as Jews and Messiah even after all of Israel has embraced the Messiah wholeheartedly. It's who Yeshua called us to be. But it has been a slow road in this regard. In 1917, a Jewish Episcopal priest, Mark Levy, actually made a proposal to the Hebrew Christian Alliance of America that would give Jewish followers of Yeshua simply the freedom to choose to observe the Sabbath, the freedom to choose to do circumcision and holy days if they wanted to. Remarkably, the proposal was overwhelmingly rejected. Nevertheless, their vision was not forgotten. There were several other Hebrew Christian communities that were established in the 20th century, gradually embracing more and more Jewish continuity until we arrive at the Messianic Jewish Synagogue. And we would be amiss if we did not recognize the role of the Holy Spirit in this whole development. There is a remarkable correlation between the history of healing prayer and the charismatic expressions of the faith and the Jewish community of Yeshua. It's for another class. We'll be discussing this at the upcoming MJTI class on healing prayer. But in short, healing prayer all but disappears in the church, just as the Jewish community vanishes into the 4th century. It's the same history. And as we see the Jewish community of Messiah beginning to reform, we see at the same time the rebirth of the Spirit in the charismatic Christian movements of the 20th century. It's the same time. Again, that chiastic view. Is the Messianic Jewish awakening a product of the awakening of the Spirit in the church? Or is the awakening of the Spirit a product of the Messianic Jewish awakening in some way? I don't know. However, the Jewish awakening within the ecclesia is an inseparable part of the charismatic renewal within the body of Messiah. Interestingly, before the Pentecostal charismatic renewal in the 1900s, Rabbi Lichtsteinstein was said to be a wonder-working chassid by other Jews. He claimed to have once met the Apostle Peter in a vision. God showed an American woman named Pauline Rose a vision of the spot on the Mount of Olives where Messiah's feet would stand when he returns with the clouds of heaven. And she brought Abram Poljak to see that spot in 1935. Abram was a Ukrainian-born Orthodox Jew who had become a follower of Yeshua after a miraculous release from a Nazi prison. He immigrated to Israel between the wars, and while he was praying on the Mount of Olives at this spot, Abram says that he received his calling and the vision to build the Messianic Jewish movement. He started the first Messianic Jewish synagogue in Jerusalem, perhaps since the days of the apostles. Amazing. They held services in a house very near to the spot on the Mount of Olives. Now, Abram Poljak said this: if the Bible is true, and if Yeshua is the Messiah and the King of the Jews, then the Messianic Jewish movement is the most important phenomenon of our time. If the Bible is true and Yeshua is the Messiah and the King of the Jews, then the Messianic Jewish movement is the most important phenomenon of our time. Similarly, in the 1950s, Rabbi Daniel Dion, an Orthodox rabbi in Bulgaria, embraced Yeshua after Yeshua appeared to him during Shacharit service, during the morning prayers. According to Tzion's account, Yeshua appeared out of the sun. He saw this vision 3 times, and the 3rd time he realized that the figure he had seen was Yeshua, and he believed. Let me pause here to have a sip for my throat, a little tickle. Now, Rabbi Daniel Dion was one of the chief rabbis of Sofia, Bulgaria during World War II. And as a Jewish believer in Yeshua, he was warned about the Holocaust in a vision from Yeshua. It's an amazing story. And then he went and helped save 800 Jews from the Nazis. But he himself was put in a concentration camp in 1943. And in 1949, he emigrated to Israel. So this is right in the heart of, these charismatic experiences. Amazing. Zion served as the president of the Union of Messianic Jews in Israel, an organization founded by Abraham Poljak. The wake of the Holocaust and the founding of the modern state of Israel drastically changed the Jewish and Christian landscape. And as we jump to what many consider a significant revival of the Spirit in the 1960s and 70s that we call the Jesus movement, when many young Jews became followers of Jesus. Of course, the 60s was a countercultural movement where young people challenged the religious institutions in America. They rejected the Hebrew Christian movement, these new Jewish believers, which had worked hard towards becoming an institution in order to be accepted by the mainstream Christian denominations. It didn't fit the counter-revolution movement. The thing that the 60s saw a rise in ethnic pride, where the American melting pot began to give way to ethnic groups celebrating their heritage. Here we have some people with a Jesus bus on the slides. And of course, in 1967, Jewish pride peaked in America following the Six-Day War. Now we move to 1970. A Jewish believer from an Orthodox background named Moshe Rosen moved to San Francisco, the heart of the countercultural movement, and formed a missionary group of passionate young Jewish believers called Jews for Jesus. Jews for Jesus took to the streets with a message of Yeshua and Jewish pride. With tracts and t-shirts and long hair and blue jeans, they passionately shared their message that believing in Jesus makes you more Jewish and not less. Jews for Jesus integrated Jewish identity and Yeshua faith in a new way. They pressed the question of Yeshua's Jewish identity worldwide. That said, at the same time, it was still under strong influence of the church's supersessionistic past. Jews for Jesus in the 1970s identified as an evangelical Christian mission to the Jews and identified within the Christian religious world primarily. Their slogan was one that one could be Jewish and believe in Jesus, but being Jewish no longer meant living within a Jewish religious framework. Jewish life and culture were a missionary tool rather than an ecclesiological commitment, you see. Perhaps these missionaries surfaced memories of anti-Jewish converts, these anti-Jewish converted Jews of the Middle Ages. And they were seen by the wider Jewish community as lions in sheep's clothing, using Jewish symbols to lure Jews away from being recognizably Jewish in a religious way. Jews for Jesus very quickly developed a deceitful reputation in the wider Jewish community and became the brand name for Jewish believers in Yeshua worldwide. So today, even when I share with another Jew that I am a Messianic Jewish rabbi, most people will, without fail, will say, "Oh, you mean Jews for Jesus. You must be a Jews for Jesus." Now, let me qualify here, because Jews for Jesus then in the 70s is not the same as Jews for Jesus today. And it presented itself very differently then than it does today as well. Today, Jews for Jesus has Messianic Jewish camps and communities and identifies much more with the Messianic Jewish movement. So I want to make that distinction. Okay, back to our timeline. The Hebrew Christian movement of the 19th and the 20th century, as it was, simply couldn't meet the needs of these new young Jewish countercultural followers of Yeshua. And in 1970, at a young person's meeting for the Hebrew Christian Alliance, 45 young people attended, and for the first time, they prayed out loud spontaneously in the name of Yeshua rather than Jesus. Interesting. There were new concerns about the Hebrew Christian community's relationship to the Jewish people. Afterward, in 1972, the entire Hebrew Christian Alliance voted to change their name to the Messianic Jewish Alliance of America, known as the MJAA. This name change reflected a significant development in the identity of the movement, and it was now seeking to identify more with the Jewish world than with the Christian's missions world. It marked the beginning of a shift in religious identity, and so the Messianic Jewish Congregation was born. Now, early Messianic Jewish congregations departed from Sunday worship and the Christian calendar that was still held by these Hebrew Christian congregations. They worshiped on Shabbat, they participated in the biblical holy days, they left behind traditional Protestant hymns in favor of a new blend of charismatic praise and worship, Israeli dance, the Jewish prayer shawl, and key prayers that were central to the Jewish liturgy experience, like the Shema. Though a radical innovation, even here, the Messianic Jewish movement remained rooted in the Christian evangelical experience. And issues like just how Jewish a Messianic Jewish synagogue should be, and involvement with the Jewish tradition, and issues along the lines of the roles of Gentiles who filled these congregations became hot topics of debate in the Messianic Jewish community. In 1979, the Union of Messianic Jewish Congregations, the UMJC, was formed. That's the denominational organization that we at Ruach Israel are a part of today. And in 2002, the UMJC approved a remarkable definition of Messianic Judaism. And let me just share with you just some sections of that. The Union of Messianic Jewish Congregations envisions Messianic Judaism as a movement of Jewish congregations and groups committed to Yeshua the Messiah that embrace the covenantal responsibility of Jewish life and identity rooted in Torah, expressed in tradition, and renewed and applied in the context of the new covenant. And I'll just highlight one other part. It goes on to say, for a Messianic Jewish group, 1, to fulfill the covenantal responsibilities incumbent upon all Jews. 2, to bear witness to Yeshua within the people of Israel. And 3, to serve as an authentic and effective representative of the Jewish people within the body of Messiah. It must place a priority on integration with the wider Jewish world while sustaining a vital corporate relationship with the Christian church. So this is the twofold community of Messiah beginning to take shape. The UMJC's desire for a reawakening of a covenantally Jewish community of Yeshua faith was remarkable. This Jewish community identifies as a part of the Jewish people, witnessing Yeshua within the people of Israel while also representing the Jewish people in the body of Messiah, the twofold community of Messiah. Now, I came to the Messianic Jewish movement with a ponytail and new to everything in 2006, unaware of this entire history. And I was brought into subgroups led mostly by members of the union, like the Hashivenu Forum, a conference to discuss the implications and the development of a post-missionary Messianic Judaism. The Messianic Jewish Theological Institute, where I eventually received my rabbinical ordination and Jewish studies education, and the Messianic Jewish Rabbinical Council, one of the first serious attempts to normalize standards of Jewish life for members who view Jewish life as an inseparable part of the identity of the Messianic Jewish community. Today, there are an estimated 250,000 Messianic Jews in America, 20,000 in Israel, and 350,000 worldwide. So the vision is here. The vision is here. That said, one only needs to be involved in the present day Messengers movement for a short while to realize that there's a lot of work to be done. We're facing a demographic crisis without enough leaders to carry our congregations in the decades ahead. Many Messianic Jewish congregations are overwhelmed by non-Jewish members and are kind of stuck between the Messianic Jewish vision that we've been talking about and the Christian Jewish roots awakening that is happening for many Gentiles today. Apart from the inner workings of the Jewish community, we face the same divisive political fronts that every other movement is experiencing right now. But you know what? I'm encouraged because we're no different than those who laid the seeds in the 19th century. They didn't see it grow into fruition. We're a part of something much larger than ourselves. We must build as best we can with the resources and the knowledge that we have. It's God's community, God's movement, and we'll likely have many more iterations in history as we are pruned and we are reshaped and we figure out new things. We don't need to see the entire picture. We just need to see our part. And one day, if we stay the course, we'll be in the history review for a future Maturing in Messiah course with one of Rabbi Rich's great-great-grandsons, discussing the origins and twists and turns of this Jewish awakening in the Messiah. And even more pressing, I think, we'll have given our best shot to do our part in the place in history that we are in. So there's a lot of work to be done. Best for us. So let's see if we can ask him. He's been on the ground here. Of course, Rabbi Rich has been the senior rabbi at Ruach Israel for 40 years. And served in the Messengers movement before that, right? Still serving full-time as Rabbi Emeritus. And when did you join the Messengers movement? It's in the 70s? Yeah, the 70s. And so anyways, I'm just thrilled to be able to ask him to share some of his experience. Why don't you tell us first, how did you get involved in the Messengers movement and how did you come to Ruach Israel and what inspired you about this?
Yeah, sure, Rabbi Nathan. Well, I got involved in the Messianic Jewish movement beginning while I was at Theological Seminary. I became a Messianic Jew in 1971, and really there was no Messianic Jewish movement to speak of at that time. And so my trajectory was to go to Theological Seminary. I went to the Biblical Theological Seminary in Philadelphia for a master's degree. And during that time, a few things happened. Number one, the fellow who led me to the Messiah, Rabbi John Fisher, he came to visit me, and he and his new wife came to visit me and Sue in our apartment in Philadelphia, and he told me about Messianic Judaism.
Mm-hmm.
And we argued like cats and dogs for 2 hours because I thought it was a horrible idea. I thought that this was just erecting all kinds of barriers between the Jews and Gentiles and all. So in other words, I was really not theologically attuned to the things that you've been talking about so beautifully in our time today. But at the end of that talk, where my wife was kicking me under the table saying, "Don't get angry, cool down." That's the truth. That really is so. At the end of it, I just began thinking about the things that he was saying. And then in 1976, I took a course at seminary called Jewish Backgrounds of the New Testament. And it was with Dr. Robert C. Newman, who to this day is a friend of
Yes,
our,
I know.
of our synagogue. You've talked to him
Yeah, we
before.
talked.
He's an astrophysicist and a theologian. And during that course, I got in touch with the literature, the Jewish literature of the time of Yeshua and the whole environment, in the environment of Israel during the time of Yeshua, during what's called the Second Temple period. And that opened me up to thinking in terms of new possibilities. Then I had one of those serendipitous, wonderful, spirit-led encounters with a fellow named Bill Lowe. Now, Bill Lowe was an elderly gentleman. He met me at the seminary, and finding out that I was Jewish, he said, "Listen, I want to take you to the Messiah Conference in Gaithersburg, Pennsylvania." And he said, "I'll pay your way, just come, and just for one day, I'll pick you up, I'll schlep you there, I'll bring you back." I said, "Okay, fine." And that was an important step too, seeing all these Jewish believers for the first time, a big group. So that was helpful. And all of that translated into a decision to join a small Messianic Jewish organization in Chicago in 1979. So Sue and I and little David Nichol, 1 year old,
Yeah.
hopped in our little 76 Subaru, and we went off to Chicago and joined Congregation B'nai Maccabeim and also this small Messianic Jewish organization. And we began to live the vision that you've been articulating, Rabbi Nathan. And so that's where it began. And then in 1981, in June of 81, another friend, Dan Juster, Rabbi Dan Juster, sent me a handwritten note that he ripped out of the kind of pad that has all the little edges, you know, what do you call that? The spiral notebook. Spiral notebook. Yeah.
Yeah.
And, "Dear Rich, there's a little congregation in Boston looking for a leader," and Sue said, "Well, why don't you call him?" And I said, "I don't want to call him." "Why don't you call him?" "I don't want to call him." I had met some of the people of earliest Ruach Israel at a conference, and I don't know, I just didn't resonate with them. She says, "Why don't you call him?" I said, "Okay, I'll call him." I called him on a Thursday night in June of 1981, and Harold Berman of blessed memory, who was one of the founders of Ruach Israel, he and I talked, and he and his wife and another couple who started Ruach Israel, their names were Shirley and Alan Weinrob. The two couples wanted to go to Florida and start a bagel business, and so there'd be no leader to this little congregation that met in a dumpy hotel on Beacon Street in Boston, 1200 Beacon Street, and the only time I could come was the next day. So, okay, I hopped on a plane the next day. I met them at the airport. It was a Friday evening service. I spoke. At the end of the meeting, we went out for Chinese food. You know, we weren't as observant. And they said, "Would you be our leader?" And I said, "Yes." It was the shortest candidate for a congregation experience in history, right? So I called Sue late that night. I said, "Susie, I think this is of God." And she said, "Okay." And we moved here 2 months later. So that's how we really got involved initially. Yeah.
Wow, that's amazing. What was, you mentioned that there, were these kind of parts along the way that led you to this. Was there one conviction or one, something that you thought was really a move of God among the Jewish people, or something that was happening here that you could, that stuck out to you in this whole journey?
Yeah. Well, I tell you, it was It was obviously a move of God, because here was this thing which hadn't been around since the earliest centuries, and recapitulating in this in the modern era. That itself was amazing. Kind of the analogy was, you had the nation of Israel kind of disappearing as a, as a nation, as a geopolitical entity, and then manifesting in 1948. You kind of can see this return. You used a very good phrase there, Rabbi Nathan, of the chiastic view of history, like the Greek letter chi, which looks like a big X, and the things you leave down here return, at the end. So that was true. But I think the big thing was an idea. I think there was an idea that was critical for me. And I just came to realize that if Yeshua is Jewish, and if God's covenant with the Jewish people is an ongoing reality, it was just the right thing to do, to, as a Jew, to join in with this amazing reality, because God made me Jewish, and he wanted me to continue on as a Jew, and wanted me to raise Jewish children. In fact, you mentioned Dave, my eldest son.
Yeah.
I mean, it's an example, and my other kids too. So I think it was a combination of just seeing this amazing reality, but also the big idea that being Jewish had a meaning that was bigger than bagels. Liking bagels better than liking baklava. I like baklava, but I like bagels better. But that's not the essence of it. The essence of it is not bagels over baklava.
Right.
The essence is a covenant with God that has to be lived out. And that's why we yearn for all Jewish believers, to whatever extent they can, to actualize that reality in their lives.
Right, as it's possible. So that's great. Thank you, Rabbi Rich. That's really, really encouraging, especially I think for those, other young adults in the movement who are trying to figure out what to do and how to get connected and this and that. And sometimes you just have to step out and do it.
Yeah.
There wasn't a contract, there wasn't anything.
Absolutely. In the hippie era, that's what we did. We just stepped out and I wasn't a hippie. I mean, not at all. I wasn't a hippie. Believe me, I was not a hippie.
Yeah.
But in that era, one of the characteristics of that era was when you found something you believed to be true, you went for it.
Yeah.
You didn't care. You just went for it. And that's mostly a very good thing.
Yeah.
You're not so self-protective.
Yeah. Yeah. That was Raina and my experience as well, when we came and just felt the Lord was calling us here, and we just made it work. It's like, that's what we're doing.
And here we are.
And I had a year of arguing too, figuring that stuff out.
Sure.
But that's really great. Now, per what Deb had just asked, I only briefly summarized from 1970s onward, because I was hoping that you might be able to give us some firsthand review from your perspective. You went through all of that together, on how Messianic Judaism has developed and changed since the early 1970s to where we are today.
Yeah. So in the early 1970s, as you pointed out, that critical date, in actually 1975, when the name was changed of the Hebrew Christian Alliance to the Messianic Jewish Alliance, very important moment. And again, it's all process. This is the way it works. It's process. It's trying. It's failing. It's recalibrating. And but the next big event, in my experience, was the formation of the Union of Messianic Jewish Congregations. And I was at its formation meeting. I wasn't one of the leaders at the time, but I was on the periphery of the room in that hotel in Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania, where a number of leaders said, listen, we need the little congregations in different cities, Chicago and in Boston and all over. We need to come together in what I would call a quasi-denominational structure, like a fellowship of congregations. And that was a big moment in terms of solidifying the identity of the Messianic Jewish reality. And one thing about the union that I loved so much is that it attracted a number of scholars, real good thinkers, guys with and some women, later on more women, but in the earliest days it was mostly guys, who really paid their dues to get PhDs and to really know their stuff. And that was helpful in shaping the ethos of the union and the future of Messianic Judaism. So the union was important. Now, you mentioned some other things that were really, really important. I want to stress that the formation of the Messianic Jewish Rabbinical Council was a major step forward, roughly 15 years ago, because you see, as Messianic Jews in our various congregations, the rules, or with the technical word is halakha, meaning what does it mean in practical terms to be a Jew and to be a believer in Yeshua? What does that mean? You could talk about keep Shabbat. All right. But what does that mean? What does it mean? We don't live in 16th century Poland. What does it mean in modern America? What does it mean in light of? So the very important step was the formation of the Messianic Jewish Rabbinical Council, because that's the group that does the heavy lifting of saying, well, what about Shabbat candles? Do we do that? Do we not? And if we do, when do we do it? And a million other questions related to the practical nitty-gritty of Messianic Judaism. So, I had the privilege of being part of all those institutions, and Ruach has had a very, very big influence, even worldwide, in terms of the development of Messianic Judaism. I suppose one other thing that I'll talk about is the Messianic Jewish Rabbinical Council, excuse me, I said that already, the Messianic Jewish Theological Institute. That's a big thing, because if you're going to have a movement, you got to have certain things. If you're going to have something that's going to last, so when your grandchildren are still around and you're the Rabbi Emeritus, right? You got to have your school, and you got to have your rabbinical association. You have to have your camps. Camp Or Lador, very, very important element in the equation. But MJTI provides it's the repository of the collective wisdom of the modern Messianic Jewish movement, trying to pass on to the next generation of rabbis and lay leaders what this thing is all about. And so that was a very important thing to be part of as well. And I'll just say, to finish up this one, it's been a great ride, not without challenges. Everything has challenges. What else is new? Life is challenging.
Sure.
Everything is challenging. But I think after having been involved this long, and will continue to be involved, I think Messianic Judaism has legs. I think it has legs. I think that it's a move of God, a move of His Spirit. It's being finding an institutional expression, and as long as we avoid certain pitfalls, which we can talk about, we will land safe, and we'll have a wonderful Messianic Judaism for the children and grandchildren of the folks on this in this class, and for you, and for me, and God willing, Messianic Judaism will grow and mature until the time that Yeshua shows up again. And we will have already learned how to dance the hora with him. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And then he bails.
That's good. I like that. You were out of the room, but I had mentioned how, what would it be like for your great grandchildren, or whatever, to be doing MIM, reviewing the past 40 years, where we are now. So it's really interesting, because we look back at the 19th century and we say, wow, look at all these things that happened in this event that happened here. And you were at those events, that will become, I think will become a shaping part of history. Yeah. So that's really exciting. Let's discuss some of the challenges. We have this vision we've been talking about to represent the Jewish fold of Messiah's community. And a piece of Israel in Messiah is a term that we use around here. So it's important that we as a community find our home within the wider Jewish world. But at the same time, we've also talked about how important it is to have this relationship with the wider Gentile Christian church, and to be these Jews and Gentiles to be able to share in this relationship of mutual blessing as communities. And we've discussed that a bit at the class. One of the struggles that the Messianic Jewish movement has had is that there are so many more non-Jewish people who want to participate. It's easier to come and want to be a part of it. That some congregations find themselves just overwhelmingly non-Jewish experiences. A house of worship that isn't a Jewish communal ecclesiological experience just because of this, but filled with people we love, and are terrific people. As Dave once said, cream of the crop, but at Ruach Israel, again, we came in here 15 years ago or so, and a lot of the things are already formed, but Ruach Israel has maintained some 80% Jewish intermarried majority over the decades. And can you give us some tips and pointers as we move forwards, how to navigate this in the days to come?
I think I can, Rabbi Nathan. I think that it all begins with a deep conviction that Messianic Judaism must be a Jewish reality. You know, it's got to be, if it's going to have any authenticity. In fact, I'll tell you, I remember my earliest days, which was more during the Hebrew Christian time and the earliest days of Messianic Judaism. I felt that if you're going to wear a yarmulke and a tallis and talk about Shabbat, you better mean it. In other words, you better not be using these things as window dressing or just for some other motive. And you've touched on that in terms of today some. But I think that realizing or beginning with the understanding that Messianic Judaism is a Jewish movement is important. In terms of the practical realities, of course, the challenge that we face is that there are, well, last I checked, about 60 million evangelical Christians, and thank God for evangelical Christianity. I don't think there'd be a Messianic Judaism without the gifts of Presbyterians and Baptists and Pentecostals to create a friendly space for us. So great, great honor is due our brothers and sisters in those communities. But I think that the fact that you have a very large number of evangelical Christians, but relatively few Jews, maybe around 6 million in the United States, maybe 14 million worldwide, that it's a numbers thing. So you have a fairly sizable segment of Gentile believers who either feel disillusioned with their own Christian backgrounds, maybe a certain amount of idealization of the Jewish people. You know, getting close to us will make them holy because we're also holy. You and I chuckle at that idea, but be that as it may, you know, there are these motivations, and there is sometimes a sincere, among some of these folks, a sincere need, a deeply rooted, time-tested need to become part of some kind of Jewish reality. So you have all this wide range of motivations, and the question then becomes, how do we navigate it? So number one, as I said, we've got to begin with the understanding that if it's going to be called a Messianic Jewish congregation, and you're going to have a Torah, and you're going to have people putting on yarmulkes, you better make sure that you really work toward having a Jewish majority of members. But there is also honor and appreciation for those Gentile believers who really do have a profound need to be part of a community like this. And there are various opportunities in that regard. For example, Ruach Israel has this beautiful building that we're in, but it's Gentile believers who had a regard for the Jewishness of the gospel who helped provide much of the volunteer labor to put up our beautiful facility. I mean, one way of being part is just to be helpful, for Christians to be helpful. How are they helpful? They got to pray for us because we're under endless satanic attack because we represent so threatening to the kingdom of darkness, okay? We need their prayers. We need, listen, Messianic Jews tend not to be moneyed people. There are some, but there are very few. Why? Because marginalized religious movements don't tend to attract money people. Money people tend to want to be with the winners, you know, be with the people of their own socioeconomic background. But by and large, we tend to be fairly highly educated people, but fiercely middle class. We don't attract, so there's financial needs. This is one level of help. There's another. Sometimes and if we have this at Ruach Israel, we have some Gentile believers come and visit us, sometimes even regularly, but they maintain their church affiliations, and that could be a very wise approach. Let's face it, the identity confusion that a Gentile family subjects themselves to by identifying primarily with us, what about their kids? Who are they going to marry? It would be better for them to maintain their primary congregational affiliation in the Baptist, Presbyterian, Pentecostal, Catholic, whatever it might be, and then to come among us to drink at the well, the Messianic Jewish well, and to be helpful to us, but to learn and to grow and to be part. And there are room for some of those people. And lastly, in terms of the strategy, there's even a smaller subset of Gentile believers who feel in the depth of their kishkes, in the depth of their being, that they want to be fully part of Israel. They want to take upon themselves the yoke of the Torah. They don't do it because they're trying to gain salvation. If they thought that, then they would be very poor candidates for this, because God loves all the boys and girls in the world, and the atonement of Messiah is big enough for everybody, no matter what your national and or ethnic background would be. So they don't worry about that, but they do have this deep and abiding thing. And so in our circles, as you know, there is a conversion process. It's rigorous, it's long. Most people should not enter into it, but occasionally you find people who, through time-tested experience in the Jewish world as Gentiles, they just feel this is something they need to do, and there is the possibility for that. So again, to review, any Messianic Jewish synagogue that's going to maintain its Jewish character has to work toward having a majority of Jewish people. Secondly, there's room for Gentile believers to connect at varying levels. That's very much the way it was in the first century, by the way, too. You had varying degrees of connection. And there's a very, very small set of people who God has just moved, and it's been demonstrated over years and years of practice, not just some romantic illusion or idea, that there is that other process. So that's my best shot on that very, very important question.
Thank you, Rabbi Rich. It's a very important question, and a challenging question.
Yes,
too.
very much so.
I know that for us at Ruach, it's really motivated out of love.
It is motivated out of love. Thank you for that, because see, it's love for our brothers and sisters in the churches. Right. We don't want them identity confused. We want them to enjoy being Baptist. That's what God made them, or Presbyterian, whatever it might be. But then to come up alongside of us as helpers and as prayers and as givers, and also to benefit from what we give. And I'm sure you've taught extensively on the economy of mutual blessing.
Mutual blessing. That's exactly right. So that Messianic Judaism isn't the house for all nations. It's not the answer. It's in partnership with the wider Christian community. That's really, really important.
Yeah.
So, and I'll just, if I could just add with conversion,
sure.
One of the reasons that people tend to convert in our community is because of Jewish background that is, distant in their few generations back.
That's right.
It's a way to clarify that, or intermarriage, things like that too.
Yes,
so
absolutely.
I appreciate you mentioning that. Let's talk about some of the things that keep congregations healthy. You've led Ruach Israel for 40 years. Built it from this small group in the hotel room. We've heard stories to what I consider to be a terrific Messianic Jewish synagogue. Many consider Ruach Israel to be one of the flagship Messianic Jewish synagogues in the movement.
True.
And can you tell us some things that have kept Ruach Israel healthy along the way?
Yes.
Spiritual advice, lessons as we go into the next 40 years, together here to stay healthy.
Yes. Well, there are a few things I could mention. Number one, I believe it's very important that the leader has strong convictions and in love is able to act out of those convictions. Because if you don't have that, the leader projects uncertainty into the community at a very profound level, which creates anxiety and ultimately translates into all kinds of disunity. And the trick there, Rabbi Nathan, and we've talked about this over the years, is you can't be overly married to the opinions of other people. Responsive, yes, absolutely. But at the end of the day, before God, through your own prayer, your own analysis of history and of the text of Scripture, your own responding to being connected to other wise leaders who can help challenge you, at the end of the day, it really does. It has to do with a leader, because if the leader is vacillating, insecure, uncertain, and too much of a people pleaser, it guarantees disequilibrium in the congregation. So that's one thing. Yes. What's another thing? I think another thing, which is not immediately apparent, but I think it is very important, is to be very truth motivated as a high value of the congregation. What do I mean by that? Truth motivated will lead us in a way which helps us navigate between opposite truth claims and helps us to integrate things in a healthy way. So, for example, at Ruach Israel, it's been very important in terms of community solidarity and just emotional and spiritual health to be able to be in Jewish space and to recognize its importance, but at the same time to really live out of a sense of deep appreciation for the historic church. Now that's a difficult thing to maintain, but it's really important, not just theoretically, but practically. I mean, if it wasn't for the historic church, there'd be no testimony of Yeshua in the world. The death of her martyrs, the work of her scholars, of her saints and sages, have preserved that testimony, and navigating, holding on to both, even though these can feel like we're being stretched out, and it's difficult, is very, very important. Another thing that's very important. So gravitation toward honesty. Another thing that I think is very, very important for the psychological and spiritual well-being of the community is for there to be a certain perception of vulnerability among the people, not just leaders. I'm not just talking leadership here, everybody. A certain sense that it's a safe place to be imperfect. Because when you have a community where the leadership mistakenly elevates holiness in such a way that you got to be perfect or you're really a deficient human being, it's not good. And so there what we need is a huge dose of the wonder of the atonement and forgiveness of God in Yeshua. Hugely, hugely important. So those are some things. Let me just think offhand if there's anything else that keeps you going. I think I'll close with this. It's related to that kind of not demanding perfection of ourselves or of other people, but it's a kind of largesse of spirit, a kind of accepting people on their own terms, at the same time challenging sin when there's evil that has to be confronted, but to have a generally sympathetic view of the human condition.
Yes.
It's hard to be a human being. It is. The world is in many ways a very difficult place. So I think that these are some of the contours of health, the gravitation toward truth, the largesse toward people, not demanding of perfection, and yet being strong and principled, and sometimes tough. Sometimes you got to be.
Yeah.
So that's my best shot.
Thank you, Rabbi Rich. These are nuggets of wisdom. I love the, living out of it's really living out of the love of Messiah that he has.
It
for
really
other people,
is living out of his matchless love.
and a lot of chesed, a lot of grace. And,
absolutely.
That's terrific. So lots to think about and to reflect on. So we've got the recording here. We'll be able to go back. Rabbi Rich, what do you think the next 10 years look like as you think about Messianic Judaism's future?
I think that there are some challenges, one of which you mentioned during the lecture today, and that is we're not training enough rabbis for the future. And to some extent, that's because there are too few pulpits where people can earn a living, that's a big deal. But I think also the general disequilibrium in society, although I think it'll have a happy ending, I think it translates into a shakeup, a shaking. In fact, I think we're entering into a period of shaking in the entire world, touching every institution of society. For example, I think that we're in the middle of a political shaking, which is going to not go away quickly. I think it's going to be ultimately very good, but it's a shaking. I think in the religious world, we're going to see a huge shaking as denominational structures are going to be challenged because of the revelation of the degree of abuse of people and all kinds of different things. I think Messianic Judaism then will experience a recalibration in terms of how it organizes itself. And here's what I envision. Congregations like Ruach and a number of others are strong congregations which will continue. But a lot of the smaller ones, I think, are either going to fail because of lack of leadership, lack of resources, and the increasing secularization of the Jewish community, and the kind of disequilibrium that is going to grab people's attention, and they're going to feel so famished that, everything is going to be shaken. I just summarize it that way. I think what we're going to find is that we're going to find more chavarot, more smaller groups of Messianic Jews, home congregations of various kinds, meeting locally or by Zoom, by electronic media, And what I'm hoping for is that we'll have hub congregations where these little groups can connect. And we've done this at Ruach. For example, there's a Chavarah that I lead, which is primarily with Jews from who are in mainstream synagogues who want Yeshua, And one of the families, which had contact with Ruach, very deep contact for several years, they needed a place for a bat mitzvah, so their daughter was bat mitzvahed here. And we, in fact, they may even be on this call for all I know. But anyhow, that's what I see. I see tremendous disequilibrium society-wide. It will affect us. I think we'll see a number of congregations failing or morphing into smaller groupings. And I think that these groupings hopefully will connect with hub congregations so that Messianic Judaism will have the suppleness, the institutional suppleness to react and to grow and prosper despite radical changes in society at large. That's what I think.
That's great, Rabbi Rich. As we look forward to the future, actually with COVID at Ruach, we've had this new idea, not only of just having virtual members, but also, wouldn't it be neat if there was a Chavarah in, I don't know, in Ohio or something, somewhere else that would want to come in and join our Zoom service but do it together in person. And then they have their own oneg and their own, social network and community. So these kinds of things can happen, with the technology that we have. And as we continue to build, along these lines, I'll just close with this last question here. I find that the history and the development of Messianic Judaism fascinating, but also I find it encouraging, even in light of what, like everything's going to be shaken. We don't know what it's going to look like, because listen, like I said earlier, the emergence of the Hebrew Christian community is remarkable. We think of Rabinowitz and Lichtsteinstein and others. They had this vision, but they were profoundly rejected by their closest Hebrew Christian friends, and they didn't see any of their vision really come to fruition. So, I'm a visionary and I love to live in the vision, and I imagine that they felt alone. They felt like this was just never going to happen, and probably were discouraged at sometimes. Also, thinking of our discussion last week, we discussed, how, like we have this vision, but we're not there yet, and so we're growing, we're small, we haven't seen this Jewish awakening in Yeshua to the extent that we want to see it. We're still growing, we're building. We've come a far way from where they are, where they were. But I guess my question is, I wonder, after 40 years of building the Messianic Jewish movement and going through these ups and downs and everything, I'm sure there are just tons of them. How do you stay encouraged? How do you stay in the vision? And what words of encouragement might you have for us, about staying encouraged?
That's easy. Well, first of all, Rabbi Nathan, I'm encouraged by you.
Thank you, Rabbi Rich.
I really mean that. And I mean that because I think you get it. And I think that you're doing a great job. So I'm encouraged personally because I have children I have a son, Dan, is moving back here soon, in large part to be part of Congregation Ruach Israel, and also to be with his siblings and with Sue and me. I'm encouraged most of all. Let me sum it up this way, because I believe that God is a God who keeps his promises, and I believe he loves the Jewish people and is going to bring us as a people in mass to him and to his Torah and to the living Torah, Yeshua. And because of the very complex interaction of human freedom and God's sovereignty, human history takes twists and turns and retrogressions and just meanders in different places. But when God says that all Israel will be brought into the fulfillment of the covenant in Yeshua, and we will look on him and we're going to receive him, and even more wonderfully, the whole world will experience blessing, incredible blessing, because of his presence when he lands on the Mount of Olives in Israel. Because this is the ultimate destiny of humanity, I can accommodate a certain amount of retrogressions, disappointments, perplexities, wrong turns. It's okay, because he who has promised is faithful. And it may not, you and I may not see the culmination. It may be 100 years from now or 200. We don't know. That's the thing about being plopped into a moment of history where our perspective is too narrow. We don't know. We don't know.
Yeah.
But you asked me the question, what keeps me encouraged? Congregation Ruach Israel, the various institutions that we've built together, the current leadership, our board is so fantastic. All the different things, and but most of all, most importantly, the promise that he's going to do it because he loves what we're doing. He loves a lot of things. It's not just he loves us only. He loves lots of things that believers are doing all over.
Yeah.
But he loves what we're doing. I believe that. So that's my answer.
That's great. That's great. Thank you, Rabbi Rich.
Yeah.
Why don't we take a moment and if you would just, I'd like to ask you to pray a blessing over our MIM class.
Sure.
And, going forward. And then I know we're up at our closing time here, but after this we can sign off if you'd like, but I think we can stay around for a few minutes if there's any questions that you guys have. So
sure.
Would you lead us in a prayer, a blessing, just to
absolutely,
bless us as we go
my delight. I see all of you in the screen there. There you are. Abba, I just want to pray a blessing on all of the people in this wonderful class, that this will be life-changing at some level for each one. Each one has their own personal story, and may you help each one integrate what they've learned into their story in a meaningful and authentic way, where they're living out of who you made them to be, and where everyone can find ways to love and appreciate this magnificent Messianic Jewish movement. I speak it over everybody here in the name of Yeshua.
Amen. Well, thank you, Rabbi Rich.
Pleasure.
Thank you. And before we take a few minutes for questions, I just want to say a thank you to all of you in the class. And again, it's just been a joy for Dave and I. We've grown so much, but remember, this is not the end of learning. We want to develop a learning community, and MIM is just the beginning of that. And so stay tuned for our Chavruta program. Again, we have this MJTI class on the Jewish Healing Reawakening, if you're interested in doing that through MJTI coming up in June. And we'll just keep learning together. All the lessons, everything will still be up, so you can continue to get caught up and whatnot as you go along. And Dave and I are here for questions and whatnot, so we'll just be in touch. Why don't we open up now for some questions? I know some of you will have to sign off, and that's great. I want to give you permission to do that. And we'll just take a few minutes to do some, if there's any questions that you guys have. Deb, I see your hand up there.
Yeah, I just did a little hesitantly. I don't want to, if anybody has it, I'd like them to go first. But, I as you, Rabbi Nathan, am a somewhat visionary, and I look for things to, move into as far as, where we can go in the whole movement type thing. But I'm really encouraged, Rabbi Rich, with all that you said as well. It's really been a big encouragement to me. And I think that, from my perspective, I can't talk for anybody else, but seeing other, conservative, Hasidic, Chabad, the way that they have integrated spreading their news all over the whole globe, well, where's our little voice and how can it be heard? But then I'm seeing, like, with new eyes, with what you just said, through, our organizations, MJTI and UMJC, and, being part of that and, taking classes has just been such a blessing on a number of levels. One, to just sink us into that Jewish space, to make us feel good about being a Jew, and realizing that community-ness, but also knowing that, this is open to so many people across the globe, our organizations. And, again, I look at our things being recorded and even online, because we have so many members coming in during our service, which is incredible. And that, you know, who knows? Again, I think I mentioned this to
Yeah.
somebody.
Hey, Deb, what's the question?
Well, okay. So the last question is that, what do you think about some of these other synagogues? You mentioned some of the little synagogues. Could there be programs to contact them and like say that we're running a, you know, teaching for rabbis or something like that? Because
Yeah.
a lot of the way that they run things is not really in Jewish space, or they have so much of other stuff in there.
Yeah. Well, there's plenty of opportunities to learn through the UMJC and through MJTI, and also there are opportunities, and of course Ruach has a great relationship with Beth Yeshua in Newton, the Russian-speaking congregation. So yeah, there are opportunities, but yeah, that's it. There are opportunities, Deb. And
Yeah,
thank you.
I think we
Yeah.
just spread the word and share about, you know, the different things that are going on.
Yeah.
That's an important thing.
Yeah.
So, yeah, thank you, Deb.
Thank
Any,
you.
any other questions? Thoughts? Okay, good. Well, that's great. They're going to send out, Shana will send out a survey, and we'd love for you to share your feedback so that we can make this better and, you know, even better in the future. And let me ask Gary, would you close us in prayer? You are our prayer closer-outer.
Thank you so much. And, you know, we were all just marveling at the wonderful teachings today and the experience that Rabbi Rich brings through the recent modern Messianic Jewish history. It's so invaluable. We're just also privileged to be part of it. So I thank the Lord for that. And we want to ask the Lord to bless this community, the vision, the passing of the baton from that previous generation that Rabbi Rich, I think, was one of the main movers of, to the next generation, which Rabbi Nathan is now the main mover of. And we want to support and bless that reality with anything we can do, through prayers, through support, through love. And we just pray that Ruach Israel would continue to move forward and take back the land and in the spiritual realm that the enemy has stolen, and reclaim it from Messiah Yeshua. Many Jewish souls are out there who are crying out. They don't even know it yet, and we want to reach them with the long arm of the mighty King, Messiah Yeshua. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Gary. Well, thank you, everyone. Go get a Shabbat nap, and we'll talk to you later. Shabbat shalom, everybody.
Shabbat shalom, everyone.
Shabbat shalom. Thank you.
Thank you so much for all the work that you put into this, Rabbi Nathan. I have learned so much and just like grown a ton from this class. So I just wanted to say thank you.
Thank you, Bess. I so appreciate you saying that. Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Hi, thank you so much.
Thank you, Brandon.
Ditto.
You can.